Hello, dear friends. Come in, find a quiet place and settle yourself. Tonight's story is not an easy one, but perhaps those are the ones most worth telling. There are corners of history we often choose to ignore, shadows that fall just beyond the reach of polite memory. And yet, within those shadows, real women once lived, worked, and faded from the world unnoticed. So gather close, if you will, for a journey into one such place, a brothel of the medieval world, and into the lives of those who were expected to endure everything while being remembered for nothing. Let us begin not with judgment or sensationalism, but with quiet observation. What we are about to explore is not a story of vice, but of survival. The medieval prostitute, contrary to the perfumes of modern fantasy, lived a life marked not by indulgence, but by exhaustion. Her body was her labor, and it was put to work far more than it was ever cared for. Hygiene, if you could call it that, was not a practice of self-respect or comfort. It was a rushed routine, done not for oneself, but for the next man who would come through the door. There was no warm water, no soap with lavender or rosemary. There was only the sharp sting of alcohol rubbed over raw skin, hastily wiping away one man's presence to make way for the next. Between clients, they cleaned themselves quickly and in silence, if they had the means to clean at all. Rags, often stained and unwashed, were used again and again. Infection was not a threat. It was a certainty. Pain was not exceptional. It was constant. But no one asked. No one ever asked how she was feeling. No one wondered if she hurt. She was a vessel of desire, not a recipient of care. And this is where we begin our story. As we walk further into this world together, I ask you to listen, not just with your mind, but with your heart. These women were not just figures in a ledger or bodies behind a curtain. They laughed once. They cried. Some had mothers. Others had daughters. All were human, and each deserved far more than they were ever given. If what we explore tonight moves something in you, let it be known. Share your thoughts, your empathy, your outrage, whatever rises. Because memory, even centuries late, can still be an act of justice. Now, close your eyes if you like, and let me bring you into the brothel itself. Not the kind you might imagine from fiction, but the real thing. Feel the thickness of the air, warm and damp with breath and sweat. Smell the heavy blend of unwashed flesh, spilled ale, and something faintly sweet, maybe herbs scattered in straw to keep the rats at bay. The floor creaks underfoot. There is no music here, just murmurs, moans, the occasional shout, and over it all, the rustle of skirts, the clinking of coin, and the quiet sigh of women too tired to hope. This is where we begin. The door was heavier than she expected. Its hinges groaned as it opened, scraping against stone, as though protesting the weight of what lay behind it. A single lantern flickered low on the far wall, casting shadows that danced across faces and floorboards alike, and then, before she could take a full step inside, it hit her. The air. It was thick, not with warmth, but with something heavier, clinging. Her nostrils flared involuntarily as the wall of smell folded around her. Sour sweat clung to the damp wood. Stale wine, spilled days ago, maybe weeks, mingled with the acrid tang of dried blood. And beneath it all, something deeper, something the nose could not name but the body recoiled from. A scent of filth and exhaustion soaked into the very bones of the place. She stopped, caught mid-step, her hand still on the doorframe. Her throat tightened. The gag rose quickly, and she bit it back, jaw clenched. Her eyes adjusted to the gloom, and in that moment of stillness, the room took notice of her, not with welcome, but with vague, passing interest. A woman glanced up from a bench. Her eyes were rimmed in shadow, her expression unreadable. Another leaned against a post, exhaling smoke from a crooked pipe. Neither spoke, neither smiled. They simply looked, and then looked away. That was all the greeting she would get. She stepped forward. The floor creaked beneath her worn boots. Not wood, but uneven stone, patched with rushes that had long since lost their fragrance. Here and there, the straw was darker, matted with things she didn't want to think about. She learned quickly to step lightly, to avoid the patches where something stuck or squelched underfoot. There was no chatter, no laughter, only a low murmur from behind a nearby curtain, the rhythmic thud of something above, and the ever-present sound of breath. So many women, breathing the same fetid air day after day, night after night. She felt eyes on her again. A girl, not much older than herself, brushed past her silently, holding a stained cloth in one hand and a half-empty bottle of something sharp-smelling in the other. The girl didn't pause, just moved as if by habit, her body loose with weariness. A voice from behind a tattered curtain called her name, hers now, not the one she was born with, and out came a woman with rough hands and tired eyes. She thrust a bundle toward her, a dress if it could be called that, faded, threadbare, and already carrying the scent of too many other bodies. Sweat, perfume, something sour that no washing would ever lift. It was not just a garment, it was a signpost, a warning, a sentence. She held it in both hands, staring down at the fabric. It was warm, recently removed from someone else. Her fingers trembled as she clutched it to her chest, not knowing yet that in time, even this would feel normal. No one told her what to do next. They didn't need to. The silence spoke well enough, and somewhere in her mind, a question echoed faintly. What is this place? There would be no answer. Not now. Only the next breath, the next step, the next task. It sagged in her hands like a burden. The dress was no longer a piece of clothing. It was something else now, a shroud of other lives, heavy with stories that no one had bothered to tell. Its fabric was rough against her fingers, coarse linen stained darker in patches. At the hem, a crusted smear of old blood clung stubbornly, like it had dried there long ago and never been truly scrubbed out. The rest of it smelled. Not of one thing, but of many. Sour sweat, stale perfume, the faint reek of spirit spilled in haste or violence. It was a scent that lived in the threads, deeper than any washing could reach. She held it up, uncertain. It was damp, not wet, just enough to be uncomfortable, sticky where it had rested in someone else's heat. For a long moment she didn't move, just stood, holding it away from her chest, like it might bite. A voice behind her, quiet, matter-of-fact. Put it on. It's all we get. She turned, catching the speaker's eye. A girl no older than herself, already in a dress nearly identical, already barefoot, already beyond resistance. The girl offered no comfort, just a glance, then moved on. She looked down again. There was no undergarment, no shoes, no drawer of personal things tucked away with care. Just this one dress, this one life, passed from hand to hand like a tool or a rag. Her arm slipped through the sleeves. The fabric clung cold to her skin, especially at the back, where the damp hadn't dried. She tugged the hem down and found it uneven. One side rose higher than the other, showing more of her leg than she wanted. There was nothing to fix it, just a stained rag on a nearby bench, which she tied loosely around her waist. Not for fashion, just for modesty, or the faint memory of it. The floor beneath her bare feet was gritty. Every step sent small discomforts shooting up her soles. Splinters, bits of straw, and things she didn't want to name. But she walked anyway, gingerly, one step, then another, the dress swaying with a weight that wasn't its own. She reached up to smooth the shoulders, then stopped. What was the point? There were no mirrors here, no reflection to check. No one cared how she looked, only that she moved when called, smiled when told, endured when expected. It was a uniform in everything but design. A signal to the world. She belonged now. Not to herself, but to the place, the purpose, the role. And as she stood in that dim room, the smells swirling around her, the sounds of others shifting and working and waiting, she felt the fabric settle against her like a second skin. Not hers, never hers. But soon it would feel that way, because it had to. The girl she was yesterday, clean, clothed, unknown, was already fading. And in her place stood someone quieter, smaller, wearing a borrowed name and a borrowed dress. The weight of it wasn't just on her shoulders, it was inside her now, and she hadn't even started working yet. Behind her, someone called toward the basin. Time to wash, or at least pretend to. It sat in the corner of the room like an afterthought. The basin, wide, shallow, and dented along one side, held water that had lost any right to be called clean. It shimmered faintly under the candlelight, not from clarity, but from the oil and grime floating on its surface. A thin layer of film clung to the edges, and beneath the surface, the water moved sluggishly, clouded with use. It was her turn. She stepped forward, heart ticking with a strange mixture of expectation and dread. Maybe it would help. Maybe she'd feel a little fresher, a little more herself after the sting of the dress and the stare of the room. She bent low, the hem of her coarse garment brushing the damp floor as she reached for the cloth draped over the edge. The rag was warm from use, slick and clinging. She wrung it once, instinctively, watching pale suds and something darker drip back into the basin. Then she began. First the face. One swift swipe across the cheeks and chin, trying to avoid her eyes. Then the armpits. One, then the other, quick and firm. And finally, the space between her legs, done with the hesitance of someone unsure whether this was cleansing or contamination. The water stung. Not clean sting, chemical, crisp, but the sour bite of old wine or vinegar poured in to kill a smell rather than a germ. Her skin tingled where she wiped, but she wasn't sure it was the feeling of purification. It felt more like surrender. Others waited behind her, leaning against the wall or sitting hunched on low stools, eyes dull, patience thin. No one rushed her, but their presence loomed. Every second she lingered at the basin meant one less for the next girl. She looked down at the rag in her hand, no cleaner than before, and gave herself one final pass across the back of her neck before tossing it back over the rim. There was no towel, just air and the scratchy fabric of her dress waiting to press against damp skin. As she stepped away, she felt no better. Not cleaner, not lighter. If anything, the ritual only deepened the feeling that nothing here truly washed away. The grime on the skin was nothing compared to what settled beneath it. The basin wasn't for them. It was for the illusion. A gesture that they had tried, that they had cared, that they were prepared. But they all knew the truth. This wasn't hygiene. It was a formality. A mask for the customers, not a kindness for the women. She sat down again, her dress clinging cold where she'd wiped. The sounds of water slapping against skin continued behind her, rhythmic and weary, like waves eroding stone. Soon she'd be shown to her resting place, a space not much cleaner than the basin. And in the silence between tasks, in the hollow before the next demand, she would lie in damp straw, sharing breath with fleas and memory with ghosts. By the time the light dimmed, and the last client's voice faded into silence, the women trickled into the sleeping room like shadows, slow, heavy, bent from the weight of another day. There were no beds in any proper sense, just heaps of straw, pressed flat by countless bodies, covered by thin, stained cloths that clung more to dirt than to softness. The girl stood in the doorway for a moment, unsure where to go. There was no assigned space, just narrow gaps between matted piles where she might find a patch of ground. A woman motioned silently toward one corner, a quieter place perhaps, or just the only one left. She stepped over limbs and cloth bundles, careful not to trip on the uneven floor, and lowered herself into the straw. It was damp beneath her, and the smell of mildew rose instantly. Bits of stalk poked through the cloth and pricked her thighs, while something tickled the back of her neck. She flinched, hand darting up, catching nothing, but the feeling lingered. Fleas, or worse. Lice lived in this room like permanent residents, dancing across scalps, burrowing into seams, impossible to be rid of. Around her, women lay shoulder to shoulder, limbs tangled, some with blankets pulled tight, others too tired to bother. One scratched furiously at her arm, muttering a curse before turning over. Another groaned softly, a sound swallowed by the heavy air. There was no talking here, just breath, heat, and the rustle of straw shifting beneath restless bodies. Someone lit a bundle of dried herbs in the corner. A brief flicker of scent, lavender maybe, or rosemary, cut through the stink of sweat, mold, and something fouler. But it didn't last. The smoke rose, curled, and vanished into the beams, leaving behind only the same oppressive weight. The girl pulled her knees to her chest, wrapping her arms around them. There was no pillow, no real covering. Her borrowed dress stuck to her skin where she had washed, and her legs were slick with heat and grime. From behind a frayed curtain, a sloshing sound echoed, the shared bucket used when someone couldn't hold the night. It often tipped, its contents soaking into the straw, unacknowledged. Privacy was a fiction here. She tried to find comfort in stillness, listening to the room settle. The soft huffs of sleep, the creak of old bones, the occasional shift of a blanket being tugged or shared. The warmth of so many bodies filled the space, but it brought no comfort, only humidity and suffocation. A single candle flickered in a dish, its flame low and tired. It danced once more before collapsing into itself, casting the room in thick darkness. No one moved to replace it. That moment, candle gone, silence complete, marked the night's end, not of hardship, but of action. A few hours of surrender before dawn demanded more. The girl closed her eyes. Sleep did not come. Not really. Only waiting. In the morning there would be food, or something like it. Another ritual in this grim routine. And no basin, no straw, no dress would be clean. Morning began not with sunlight, but with a shuffle of limbs and the faint clatter of bowls from the adjoining room. Hunger, more than habit, pulled the women upright, aching bodies dragging themselves across the floor toward a meal that promised little more than warmth and weight. The food was already waiting, crusts of dry bread stacked in a dented tin basin, a pot of stew thinned to near broth, and a jug of wine that smelled slightly off, like fruit left out too long. No plates, no spoons, just fingers and speed. The girl sat cross-legged on the floor, close to the straw bed she'd hardly slept on. She reached for a hunk of bread, its edges hard enough to scratch her lip. Beside her, an older woman dipped her piece into the watery stew, then wiped her fingers on a rag hanging from her waist, the same rag she'd used to clean herself earlier. No one flinched. At first, the girl hesitated. Her stomach churned at the sight, the limp carrots floating in brownish water, the slick sheen of grease on the surface. But hunger overruled revulsion. She tore a chunk from the bread and dunked it, avoiding thought. The stew was hot but bland, its saltiness clinging to her tongue. The wine came last. A tin cup passed hand to hand, wiped half-heartedly with fingers before reaching the next. She sipped and winced. It was sharp, sour, and thick at the bottom. But it dulled the edge of wakefulness, and for many that was enough. No one spoke much. A woman muttered, "Eat fast, they're waiting," as she shoved the last of her bread into her mouth, already standing. The girl nodded, chewing mechanically. By the third day, she stopped smelling the rags. She no longer noticed whose hands had touched the bread before hers. The ritual became muscle memory. Grab, dip, swallow. Meals weren't about pleasure or pause. They were about keeping upright, staying warm, avoiding fainting. Fuel, not food. They ate wherever space allowed, on floorboards still damp from the night spills, beside beds that reeked of sweat and old straw. The bucket behind the curtain had already been used. Its sharp stench hovered in the corners, ignored out of necessity. A fly landed on the girl's knuckle as she brought bread to her mouth. She shook it off and kept chewing. There was no place here for squeamishness. Not anymore. When the food was gone, she wiped her mouth with the back of her hand, then with the same rag she'd used on her legs earlier. No one cared. The day had begun. Another girl rose, pulling her hair back with a piece of string. Lice would already be nesting, and combs were few. The real struggle now began, not with clients, but with the daily erosion of self. And so the girl stood too, her belly not full, but no longer hollow, her face streaked with dried stew. She was starting to move in rhythm now, to learn when to speak, when to stay quiet, when to eat, and when to forget what the food had tasted like. Next came the hair, another reminder of what could no longer be called her own. Hair, once perhaps a source of pride or identity, lost its meaning quickly in this place. It became just another burden, something to control, to hide, to survive through. No one here had the time, the tools, or the water to wash it properly. Sweat and dust turned it into ropes. Lice made homes in the warmth of the scalp, crawling freely between strands and from woman to woman in the night. The girl ran her fingers through hers on the second morning, hoping to part it cleanly, maybe braid it the way she used to. But her fingers snagged almost immediately. Knots clung stubbornly, greasy and tight, and with every tug, she winced. Something moved beneath her touch. She pulled her hand away and stared. 2 tiny lice crawled across her palm. Around her, other women were already working on their own hair. Some scraped ash into their scalps, a crude remedy meant to suffocate the lice. Others rubbed vinegar or old wine when they could spare it, not to cleanse, but to sting the scalp into submission. A few sat with knives or dull blades, hacking off chunks, leaving uneven patches and scabs. The most tired simply tied their hair back with string and gave up. A girl beside her leaned in, speaking low through cracked lips. "Shave it. It's easier." Her own hair was almost gone, reduced to a patchy buzz. The girl hesitated, clutching a handful of her own curls, but said nothing. The knots were too thick and she didn't have a blade, so she did what she could. She found a broken comb, half its teeth missing, its handle wrapped in a strip of cloth. Slowly, painfully, she dragged it through her hair, biting the inside of her cheek each time it caught. Tears welled, not just from the pain, but from the knowledge that this too would happen again tomorrow, and the day after. She saw now how hair marked them. The clients never noticed, but among the women it mattered. Clean hair meant you were new or lucky. Matted hair meant you belonged. The longer you stayed, the more it showed. Hair crusted with ash, shorn in patches, hiding sores underneath. No mirror was needed to know how far you'd fallen. The lice didn't discriminate. They bit behind the ears, at the base of the neck, anywhere warm. Scratching became second nature. Soft at first, then harder, until skin broke. The girl learned not to mind. Everyone did. Finally, she gathered her hair back and tied it with a frayed string someone had left on a windowsill. It was sticky and smelled faintly of stew, but it held. Strands stuck out in every direction. Her scalp itched, but it was done. At least for now. She no longer looked like herself in her mind's eye. She looked like them. Another girl with lice in her hair, calluses on her feet, and no time for vanity. Somewhere another woman coughed. Someone else cursed and flicked a bug off their shoulder. The day moved forward, indifferent, and the girl moved with it. Next came the mouth, the place shame hides even after everything else is stripped away. The mouth was a battlefield no one saw until it was too late. It fought a quiet, losing war, against rot, against breath gone sour, against the illusion of charm they were expected to wear. In this place, smiles were currency, but behind every forced grin was the sting of salt in cracked lips, the ache of swollen gums, and the shame of decay that couldn't be hidden for long. They were given no brushes, no pastes, only twigs, thin and splintering, pulled from a basket by the door. Some were chewed soft at one end, meant to scrub teeth the way animals gnaw bones clean. Others were too dry to bend, too sharp to use without drawing blood. The girl picked one, unsure how to begin. She had seen another woman rubbing one side to fray the tip, so she did the same. The first touch to her teeth made her wince. The scraping sound echoed in her head, louder than it should have. She chewed, moving the twig along her gums. Then she gagged, The taste was dry bark and old vinegar. Her jaw tensed. She tried again. Blood came next, rusty, warm, pooling beneath her tongue. She spat it out beside the straw, wiped her chin, and kept going. The others did too. Mint leaves came on lucky days, not fresh but dried and curled at the edges. They masked the breath for a while, just long enough for a client to pretend they didn't smell the truth. Sometimes they used charcoal, powdered from the cooking fire, rubbed along the teeth with a fingertip. It left a black stain on lips and fingers, but at least it felt like it did something. Her lips cracked more each day, split open at the corners when she tried to smile. The cold at night didn't help, nor did the cheap wine they swished like mouthwash. Teeth loosened over time. Gums swelled. Breath turned foul despite every effort. But they kept trying, because they had to. Men expected beauty even here. They expected softness and scent and the illusion of care. So she learned to smile with her lips closed, barely a curve, just enough to suggest warmth. It became habit, reflex, a way to hide what her mouth could no longer do. She watched others do the same. Some covered their mouths with hands when they laughed. Others turned their heads when they spoke. The shame was silent, but constant. She chewed until her gums bled, hoping it was enough. The narrator's voice lingered on the thought as she reached for a cup of sour wine and rinsed. The sting brought tears, but she held them back. She spat again. A red smear hit the floor and spread like ink on paper. She knew it wouldn't last. The smell would return, the taste, the ache. But for a little while, it would seem clean, seem normal. And in this place, seeming was the best anyone could hope for. Soon, though, came the part no one spoke about openly, the bleeding that marked each month, and the buckets that offered no dignity. It came, as it always did, without mercy, without pause. The blood, the ache low in the belly, the heaviness that dragged through her limbs. In another life, it might have meant rest, a warm cloth, time to lie down. Here, it meant only the need for secrecy and the threat of punishment if a client noticed. The rags were cut from whatever could be spared. Old shifts, frayed linen, curtains that had once hung to give privacy now torn into strips. They were folded tightly, layered to hold as much as they could, and tucked between trembling thighs. But the fabric shifted with movement, slipped when she worked, and left stains she scrambled to hide. Some rags bore the ghosts of many months, faint shadows of rust that no amount of rinsing could lift. She learned fast. When it began, she found a corner behind the curtain and wrapped the cloth in shaking hands. There was no soap, no fresh water. Only the same basin used for wiping skin, now tinged pink with someone else's blood. She dipped her rag, wrung it, folded it, and pressed it into place. A woman beside her noticed, whispered low, barely audible over the creak of beds and the murmur of footsteps. "Keep it hidden, they don't care, not unless it stains their sheets." She nodded and did as she was told. The pain in her belly tightened with each movement, but there was no resting. Clients still came, impatient and unaware, or uncaring. She clenched her jaw through cramps, arched her back just right to keep from pressing too hard on the tender ache. She wiped herself between men, barely managing to change the cloth before being called again. Sometimes the rag was too damp to reuse, but she had no choice. The cold wetness between her legs made her flinch, but she shoved the feeling down. No one spoke of infections here. When someone grew feverish, they were left to sweat it out under a thin blanket. If they healed, they worked again. If not, they were taken away. Each night she rinsed her cloth in silence, watching the blood swirl in the basin already stained with others' secrets. She'd squeeze it out and hang it from a nail near the candle to dry, pretending it would be cleaner in the morning. Her second month, the blood came heavier. She folded 2 rags together, walking stiffly, hoping it would hold. It didn't. She felt it halfway through the night, a warm trickle down her thigh, panic rising. She slipped away, wiped herself as best she could, returned with a new cloth, and kept her head down. No one said anything. They all knew. They all remembered. By the 3rd month, she stopped flinching. she stopped counting the days. She learned to feel the shift of the rag and fix it with one hand beneath her skirt, while the other pretended composure. There was no dignity in it, only the discipline of survival. And when the moment came, blood still seeping, thighs sore and raw, she simply adjusted the cloth again and walked to the next man waiting in the dark. No words, no complaints, just motion. Tomorrow she would shave again, and with that came new pain, sharp and deliberate. The blade wasn't a blade at all, just a shard of rust-tinged metal, its edge uneven, dulled by overuse and time. It had once belonged to a tool, perhaps a knife or mirror, but here it served a different purpose, one never spoken of without a sigh or flinch. No one had soap. There was no hot water, no fresh towel laid out with care. Just spit, sometimes a smear of kitchen grease if they were lucky, and trembling fingers trying to make the skin smooth enough for the men who cared more about the feel than the pain left behind. She watched the others first. Squatting in front of a cracked basin, legs parted, they worked with practiced motion, quick strokes, then flicks of red as the nicks appeared. No one winced, not anymore. When it was her turn, the older girl handed her the blade with a glance. "Press lighter, or it'll scar," she said, voice low, without warmth but not without care. She crouched, spreading the folds of skin with one hand, blade in the other. The first drag burned even before it drew blood. A fine line opened, red against pale. She hissed but kept going. There was no mirror. She shaved by feel, judging the patches of stubble with her fingertips, guiding the shard with hesitance that quickly gave way to urgency. Smooth skin was expected, demanded. If a client complained, there would be punishment, not always from the madam, sometimes from the client himself. A welt, a slap, a withheld payment. So she shaved closer. The second cut stung more. A bead of blood rolled down her thigh. She wiped it away and continued, trying to remember where she'd already passed the blade, what was done, what wasn't. It was all guesswork. There was no disinfectant, no ointment. The rag she used to wipe the blade was the same she'd used to clean the basin earlier. Infection was common. So were the rashes, angry red welts that spread across her skin, itching until they bled. She learned to ignore them, learned to sit without shifting too much, to walk without showing her limp. Sometimes, after a particularly rushed shave, she couldn't even bear to sit. The rawness between her legs pulsed, a silent throb that reminded her she'd done what she had to. An older girl helped her once, showed her how to pull the skin taut in places she couldn't see, guided her hand gently like passing on a cruel rite. "There," she said, tapping a spot. "That one always catches. Be careful." She finished that day with 5 cuts and a rash that bloomed by nightfall. She didn't cry. She dipped the cloth in cold water, pressed it between her legs, and counted slowly as the sting numbed into something she could bear. When the bell rang, calling her to work, she wrapped a strip of cloth around the worst cut. It stuck to the wound almost instantly, but she knew better than to pull it away. Let it dry. Let it crust. She stood, wiped her palms on her shift, and stepped out of the dark corner into the darker hallway. Behind her, someone else picked up the same shard of metal. Next came the cleaning, the only moment between men, when the blood, sweat, and shame were wiped away, as quickly as possible. There was no time. There never was. The moment one client left, the next might already be waiting, just beyond the curtain, coins in hand, breath sour with wine and anticipation. In the seconds between, she cleaned herself in a blur, body still trembling, skin sore. The tools were always the same. A chipped tin bowl, half filled with salt water that had turned cloudy from too much use, or worse, alcohol that reeked of cheap grain and burned like fire. She didn't even flinch anymore when it touched raw skin. Not outwardly, at least. She dipped the rag, fraying at the corners, stiff with old stains, into the bowl, and pressed it between her thighs. The sting hit like a slap. She bit her lip to hide the pain. No time to be tender. No time to pause. The salt licked the cuts from shaving, the bruises from rough hands. the thin skin already torn too many times. In the dim corner of the room, hunched near the bed, she worked quickly. The shift still bunched around her waist, her bare legs spread just enough. Around her, other girls did the same. No one looked at each other. No one spoke. The air smelled of sweat, blood, and perfume. A sickening mix meant to hide what never could be hidden. The alcohol didn't clean, not really. It masked the scent, dulled the feeling, fooled the next man long enough to get through the next act. That was the point. Not hygiene, not health. Just enough illusion to keep things moving. Sometimes the burning wouldn't fade even after she was dressed again. The skin stayed red, angry, throbbing, but still, she would smile, or try to. Still, she would lie down, spread her legs, and let the next man pretend she was untouched. The cloths were shared, hidden under a blanket or mattress. No one had their own. They were rinsed in the same dirty water, wrung out, hung to dry on nails in the wall, then used again. She'd learned to choose the one that smelled least foul. It was a small comfort, almost laughable. Infections came and went. Some girls swelled up so badly they couldn't walk straight. One had to be carried out in the night, fevered and weeping. No one asked where she went. They just moved her mattress aside and spread another in its place. That day, the girl cleaned faster than usual. Her last client had been rough, leaving her with a deep scrape on the inside of her thigh. She didn't look at it, didn't touch it more than she had to, just splashed the alcohol and prayed it would dry before she bled again. She pulled her dress down, tugged the shoulder back over her arm, smoothed her hair without thinking. The tin bowl went under the bed. The rag disappeared beneath the blanket. She stood, blinked once, and opened the curtain. The next man was already stepping forward, and her mouth twisted into something like a smile. Now her hair, sticky with sweat and stained with oil, would beg for care she could no longer give. The hair was the first thing to go, slowly, quietly, until one day it wasn't hair anymore, just a burden dragging down her scalp. It clung to her skin in thick ropes, sticky with sweat, oil, and the invisible filth of too many nights. The strands twisted together like knotted thread, some clumped with old blood or the dried remnants of a man's breath. And always, always the itch. Tiny legs crawling, biting, breeding in the warmth behind her ears and at the nape of her neck. She had tried. They all had at first. A bucket of cold water dumped over her head, a handful of ash rubbed deep into the roots, an old comb with half its teeth missing yanked through snarls that screamed with every pull. She remembered her first attempt, kneeling on the floor, tugging at a stubborn knot until the comb snapped in half and her scalp bled. An older girl had passed by, eyes dull, and muttered, "It's not worth the pain." She had been right. Now the comb was kept on a hook in the wall, crusted with strands from a dozen girls, passed around like a shared burden. No one cleaned it. No one dared complain. There were more important things to tend to, more pressing parts of the body that earned coin and demanded upkeep. The lice didn't care. They thrived, nested, multiplied. If she scratched too hard, her nails came back red. Still, the itch never stopped. Some girls shaved it all off, awkward patches missing, tufts clinging on like defiance. One used a broken blade and sliced her scalp so badly the wound turned green. Another simply cut hers with a rusted knife, chunk by chunk, until her head looked like a half-plucked chicken. The girl tried tying it back. Every morning she gathered the mess into a loose knot, using string or a torn strip of cloth. It didn't help. Strands escaped, curled around her cheeks, stuck to her lips. Men didn't seem to mind. Some even liked it. They called it wild. But outside the brothel, when she fetched water or stood in the market, she could feel the stares. Hair like that told a story. No one had to ask where she worked. The stink of oil and decay clung to her head like a brand. Children whispered. Women turned away. So, she covered it. A scarf, stolen from a client's discarded pile, thin and faded, but wide enough to wrap around her crown. It didn't stop the lice. Didn't hide the smell. but it gave her the illusion of distance. From them, from what she had become. She tied it tight one morning, the itch pulsing beneath the fabric, and caught her reflection in a chipped mirror. A stranger stared back, eyes hollow, hair hidden, mouth clamped shut. There was pride in the act, though small, in covering what she couldn't fix, in choosing what little control was left. She stepped into the hallway, adjusting the scarf one last time. Her lips parted slightly, but not to smile. That, too, had become another battlefield. Now, it was the mouth's turn to betray her. She chewed until her tongue went numb. A bitter root, stiff and fibrous, sat between her teeth, its bark splintering into her gums, its taste sharp enough to sting the back of her throat. It wasn't mint, though once someone said it was close. The truth didn't matter. The hope of masking what lay beneath was enough. The mouth, more than any other part of her, betrayed her. There had been a time when she tried harder. She remembered the first twig she used, a thin, fraying stick from the alley tree, its end chewed soft so it could scrape across her teeth. It tasted of bark and dirt. The effort made her gag. Still, she dragged it back and forth until blood pooled along her gum line, and she spat a dark red stain onto the ground. Charcoal came next, burnt wood crushed into a shared bowl, dipped into with trembling fingers. The powder made her teeth feel rough, like they were crumbling, but it absorbed the smell, at least for a while. Mint was rare. A passing merchant once threw a handful of wilted leaves onto the brothel steps, more of a joke than a gift. The girls fought over them like dogs. She managed to get one, rubbed it on her tongue until it tore. None of it worked for long. The rot was deeper, hidden in the roots of her teeth, in the swollen pockets of her gums. One molar wiggled now, loose and aching, but she couldn't risk pulling it out. There was no one to stitch the gap. Another tooth had broken months ago, split in half during a meal of hard bread. The jagged edge still cut her tongue when she spoke too quickly. Her lips were cracked, dry from heat and dehydration. They bled when she smiled too wide, so she didn't. Clients wanted the illusion of beauty, a warm mouth, clean breath, a girl who laughed without covering her face. But the truth curled behind her tongue like a secret she dared not speak. She learned to talk without opening too wide, learned to tilt her head slightly, let her hair fall forward when she spoke. If she laughed, it was behind her hand. And if a man asked her to kiss him, she turned her face aside, claiming modesty. It was shame, not modesty. At night, when the others slept, she sometimes pressed a cold cloth to her jaw where it throbbed. She bit down on rags to dull the pain. She whispered to no one in particular, promising to pull the worst one soon. Just not today. Not yet. The bitter root in her mouth had gone soft now. She spat it out into her palm, glanced at it. A poor excuse for cleanliness. A lie she told with every breath. But it was all she had. She tucked the rag away, wiped her mouth, and stood. Her hands trembled as she reached for the door, fingers worn from labor, scarred and cracked. If the mouth was ruined, the hands told a story even louder. "Damn this rag, it burns," she whispered it under her breath, voice tight, fingers curled around the soaked cloth. The sting was instant, wine in open wounds, ash in the raw splits of her skin. But she kept scrubbing, jaw clenched, breath shallow. There was no other choice. Her hands had once been soft. She remembered that vaguely, how she used to trace the wooden edge of her family's cooking bowl, nails clean, palms unscarred. That memory had been scrubbed away just like everything else. Now her knuckles cracked when she moved them. Red lines ran across her skin like veins of fire, splitting wider with each day. Fingernails were jagged, chewed down by necessity, some darkened with grime that refused to leave no matter how hard she scraped. Cleaning was constant, after every client, before the next, between chores, between meals, a bucket of gray water, a hunk of sour wine, sometimes even spit. Ash was the worst, coarse and dry, ground into open wounds. It clung to her flesh like guilt. She wiped down a bench with shaking fingers, the cloth sticking where blood had dried. The sting made her flinch, but no one looked up. No one had time for pain. The hands were always visible. You could hide your face with makeup, cover your hair with a scarf. You could smile and say little. But the hands, rough, red, always moving, told the truth. They told what kind of girl you were, how long you'd lasted, how much you'd suffered. Some of the older women wrapped their fingers at night. Bits of linen stolen from discarded gowns, bound tight and rubbed with grease saved from cooking pans. It helped a little. In the morning, the wraps were stained dark, red, brown, black. She tried that too. But linen wore thin fast, and grease didn't heal. Still, she kept working. The bucket had to be emptied, the sheet changed, the corner cleaned of its quiet filth. Each task added another line to her palm, another slice to the backs of her fingers. She noticed one cut had gone yellow at the edge. It pulsed when touched, but if she stopped to tend to it, she'd fall behind. Someone would notice. Someone would say she was lazy, and no one wanted to be called that. She finished wiping, tossed the rag aside, and flexed her hand. The skin across her knuckles split anew. Blood welled up again, slow and tired. She didn't flinch this time. The pain had become ordinary. She pressed her palm against the wall for balance, took a breath, and moved to the bed to straighten the blanket. Her fingers left a faint red streak across the fabric. She didn't wipe it away. There was no point. It would soon be stained again. As she reached for the corner of the sheet, her hands trembled, not from fear, but from exhaustion. The weight of endless tasks. The slow erosion of skin turned to stone. The hands were no longer hers. They were tools now. Instruments of labor, of service. And still, they worked. But even they could not reach the ache buried deeper, where the pain hid between her legs, quiet and constant. She hid the pain, like always. It was the kind of ache that never fully left, only faded when she lay still long enough, an impossible luxury. Between her legs, the skin had darkened, rubbed raw from friction, pressure, and too little rest. Each step dragged along the edge of agony. She walked carefully as if balancing something fragile between her thighs. The others moved the same way. She watched them sometimes, how they adjusted their stance, leaned on one leg more than the other, took short, stiff steps to keep the burning at bay. It wasn't grace. It was survival. There were open sores, though no one dared call them that. No ointment, no doctor. Just cloth rags folded into crude pads, tied tight with string or knotted between worn underthings. The bundles were meant to soothe, but they shifted when she walked, bunched up when she knelt, and rubbed even more than bare skin. Some girls used spit, others grease skimmed from the cooking pan, barely cooled. One rubbed a bit of leftover soap between her legs once. She screamed for an hour. After that, no one tried soap again. She once found a leaf pressed between the pages of an old Bible in the kitchen. It smelled sharp and green. She ground it between her fingers, rubbed the pulp over a swollen patch of skin, and waited. For a moment, the sting vanished, but by morning, the patch had turned purple. Still, she did not complain. A girl who complains draws attention. Attention meant questions. Questions led to punishment or worse, being replaced, labeled as dirty, unfit, a problem. So she told no one. She only nodded when spoken to, shifted her weight when the pain flared, and never touched the area in front of others. Only in the dark, when she curled into herself, did her fingers trace the damage. Rough skin. Wet patches where pus had formed. A sting if she pressed too hard. But she didn't stop. She needed to know what still worked, what still hurt. And it all still hurt. Once, an older girl had whispered, "Press a warm cloth there. Not too wet. Just warm." She had tried it, folding a cloth against herself. The warmth dulled the ache, but there was never time to do it again. Clients didn't care. Some noticed the flinch when they pushed too hard, but most didn't. Some wanted the pain, in fact, liked the wince, the stiff body, the bitten lip. After each visit, she sat still for a moment, legs apart, breath caught in her throat. She'd wipe herself roughly, Clean with a dry cloth or nothing at all, and try not to look at what stained the fabric. Then she stood, slow and careful, pressing her palm flat against her thigh where it throbbed. She counted to 5, braced herself, and pulled the cloth tighter between her legs. Because someone was knocking, or calling, or waiting, and pain had no place in the schedule. The body moved again. No pause, no healing. There was still the matter of breaks, those rare, almost mythic things, where even hygiene became a gamble. "Hurry up, he's here!" The words rang down the hallway, sharp and impatient, cutting through the silence like a blade. She barely had time to breathe. One client gone, another already on the stairs. There was no pause, no moment to gather herself, no time to clean what had just been used. Her legs still sticky, her hair clinging to her neck with sweat, she grabbed a stained cloth from the corner and wiped herself quickly. It wasn't clean. It wasn't even damp anymore. But it was all she had. She rubbed under her arms with her sleeve, then between her legs again, careful not to press too hard. The rag caught on a sore and she hissed, pulling it back, only to use it again. There was no choice. Water was a luxury, kept behind the kitchen or down in the alley if someone had remembered to fill the bucket. But that water was meant for boiling tea, not washing bodies. The girls were told to be resourceful, not demanding. Privacy didn't exist. If she was lucky, she could turn her back in a corner, shielded by her own shadow and the curve of the wall. Most of the time she cleaned while half-dressed, while another girl redid her hair, or someone else stepped into the same room for a moment of breath. Every part of her smelled of others. Men left their scent like a stain, on her skin, in her sheets, between her fingers. She would scrub if there was time, but there never was. Even wiping was an act of speed, not care. She'd learned to hold her breath while cleaning, to ignore the stink, to count to 5 and move on. Because if she didn't, she would be yelled at. Or worse, skipped over. No one cared if she felt clean. Clean was for the men, not for her. She was to appear clean, barely scented, somewhat powdered, just enough to trick the senses. The rest? It didn't matter. Beneath the clothes, she stank of sweat, of sour linen, of blood that never quite dried. At night, or what passed for night, she collapsed onto the straw mattress. Her shift sometimes ended with her half-dressed, legs curled up, face pressed into her own arm to dull the smell of others. She didn't always undress. She didn't always know when the next knock would come. Sleep was shallow. The body rested in pieces, feet numb, fingers twitching, mind still alert to voices, to footsteps on stairs. Sometimes she dreamed of water, a real bath, soap with a scent. A bucket poured slowly, not slapped over her head. But dreams didn't last. A knock. She startled awake. The cloth beside her was crusted and stiff. She pressed it to her face anyway, wiped her mouth and stood. Her dress was already halfway on. Another one waiting. No time to be anyone but what they needed. Still aching, still unwashed, still bearing the smells of others, she stepped forward, and the door opened again. The skin remembers, the smells remain, and so we move now to the lingering scent of strangers left behind. She breathed through her mouth to cope. The smell hit first, always. Before the door even shut behind him, it clung to her. The sour tang of sweat soaked into old linen, the sharp rot of tobacco chewed and spat, or the thick syrup of oil slathered onto chests, trying to pass for charm. Some smelled of animals, livestock clinging to boots and fingernails. Others carried the stink of ale from unwashed beards, of garlic from midday meals. And a few came drenched in perfume, cheap or stolen, so thick it made her eyes water. It didn't matter who they were. The moment they touched her, their scent transferred, into her hair, onto her neck, beneath her arms. It mixed with what was already there, the last man's musk, the sweat from her last shift, the staleness of closed rooms and shared air. She scrubbed. Her arms were raw from it, cloth soaked in mint water, if it could be spared. A spritz of rose, when someone generous left it behind, but none of it lasted. The mint faded in minutes. The rosewater turned sour. And the base, the rank truth, remained. At first, she'd gag. She'd sneak to a corner, trying to wipe herself clean between clients. She'd twist her nose away mid-act, hoping they wouldn't notice. Once she vomited into a rag after a man left, a mixture of sweat, cologne, and meat turning her stomach. But over time, she learned not to react. Recoil drew attention. Disgust was punished. So she smiled, or at least kept her face blank. Behind her teeth, though, she swallowed it all. The smells got under her nails, into her pores. The bed sheets held them, the walls held them. Even her own breath began to carry the scent of others. Her nose itched constantly. Some perfumes triggered headaches. Once, her skin broke out in red patches from whatever oils a man had soaked himself in. But there was nowhere to go. No windows. No draft. The rooms held the air like a secret, stale and warm and saturated with every body that had ever passed through. She'd wave a hand in front of her face after they left, not to clear the smell, just to move it. And still, they came. Each one left a layer. She would sleep that way sometimes, not even changing clothes, just rolling over, burying her face in her sleeve, and hoping the scent was her own. It never was. She'd lift her arm, inhale, and know someone else had been there. Someone's hands, someone's mouth, someone's cologne. She didn't flinch anymore. Now, she only noticed when the smells were gone. When, for a brief second, she was alone with her own skin again. But even that didn't last, because someone was always next. The smells stain more than skin. They settle into every surface. And so we move now to the beds, where filth is not just expected, it is inescapable. "Don't sleep too deep," she whispered, scratching at her thigh. "The fleas bite worse when you dream." The bed wasn't a bed, not really. Just a heap of flattened straw spread beneath a sackcloth stained by too many bodies. In dry months, the straw prickled and broke beneath her weight. In wet seasons, it clumped and molded, the damp rising through her spine like rot. She tried to fix it, once. Scooping up the worst of the straw, she shook it out behind the building. Dust and spores rose in a cloud. She gagged and kept going, searching for handfuls that weren't black with damp or slick with someone else's sweat. When she could, she layered fresh cloth over it. But even the clean cloth bore marks, stiff brown patches, blood stains, and the sour stench of mildew that no drying sun could cure. Fleas were always there. They moved in with the first clients and never left. Some nights, she'd wake mid-scratch, her nails raking her skin until it bled. Lice, too, crawling across her scalp, biting behind her ears, nesting in the seams of her shift. And then came the bites that didn't heal. Scratching broke skin. Skin invited infection. Infection burned and festered. The straw wasn't just straw. It was needles soaked in filth, pressed into open wounds. Still, the women lay down. Where else could they go? The floor was no better. Cold stone, crawling with damp. The corner, already taken. The doorframe, a draft that froze the bones. So they made do. She wrapped her ankles in rags to slow the bites, rubbed grease around scabs to keep the flies off. Sometimes she'd share body heat with another girl, curled back to back for warmth, pretending not to notice the lice crawling from one scalp to the other. Rest wasn't rest. It was a brief collapse. She never fully slept, just drifted, one eye half open, one hand resting near her jaw to swat whatever bit her next. And when she dreamed, the dreams weren't kind. She dreamt of clean sheets and soft pillows, yes, but also of itching, of limbs that wouldn't stop twitching, of waking to find bugs in her mouth or her ear or worse. Morning never brought relief, only the next man, the next order, the next stain. By then, the straw was flattened again. She rolled onto her side, pulled the cloth over her shoulders, and scratched at a welt behind her knee. She'd counted 15 on that leg alone. The whisper came again from someone nearby. Maybe the girl beside her, maybe a voice in her own mind. "Don't sleep too deep." not because of danger, not even because of men, but because the bed itself was the enemy. There was no true rest, not here, not for them, and when the body couldn't recover, the filth around them took over. So now we move to where it collects, into the communal spaces where the waste piles high and escape is nowhere in sight. She held her breath and stepped away. The chamber pot had tipped sometime in the night. No one knew when. No one cared. A slick, dark puddle soaked into the straw at the foot of the bed, trailing a faint, sour line toward the nearest wall. Someone had tried to throw ash on it, just a handful, but it clumped uselessly, forming a gray paste that stuck to the soles of bare feet. It was like this everywhere. The communal spaces weren't really spaces, just gaps between the beds or narrow corridors that threaded between leaning walls. Chamber pots gathered in corners, always full, rarely emptied. Sometimes they sloshed over. Sometimes they simply stayed until the stench forced a reluctant girl to drag them outside. No routine, no rota, no assigned hand for cleaning, only guilt or desperation. Rags lay scattered across the floor, hardened with old blood, mucus, or worse. No one knew whose they were. Sometimes the women used them. Sometimes they stepped over them. Sometimes they didn't notice them at all. There were no mops, no clean cloths, no soap. When the floor became unbearable, they'd splash it with wine dregs or ash, just enough to dull the smell, not enough to clean. The liquid pooled along the floorboards, mingling with rot and insects. The air was thick, stale sweat, human waste, sour wine, old smoke clinging to the rafters. Every breath came with a taste. Some tried to mask it, chewing mint or sucking charcoal, but it never lasted. The stench lived in the walls. She moved carefully, her bare feet calloused against the wood. She'd learned where not to step. One spot near the corner sank underfoot, another squelched in the summer. She never looked too closely. The girl ducked her head as she passed a crooked beam, pressing her fingers to her nose. The reek from the tipped pot curled up into her nostrils, a hot, sickly vapor. She paused only to shift a rag with her toe. It stuck for a moment, then flopped over, revealing a yellow crust at the center. She didn't gag anymore. That reflex was long gone. Sometimes rashes spread across the women's thighs, red and raw from the damp and the filth. Other times it was boils, or odd fevers that came and went. No one asked for help. There was no medicine, only spit, ash, or grease. Once, a girl collapsed in the corner and didn't rise for a day. They gave her space, stepping over her body. When she woke, she wiped her mouth with a soiled sleeve and kept moving. This was the routine. No routine at all. She reached the far corner of the room, the one where the floor rose slightly and the smell was a little less sharp. That was where she stayed when she could, just to think, just to breathe. But the chamber pot's sour edge reached even here. So she sat with her knees hugged to her chest, lips pressed tight, and waited for the next knock. Even filth could be endured, if not escaped. But not every man was so tolerant. Some noticed. Some turned up their noses. And when they did, the punishment was swift. Let's turn now to the clients, and how even their disgust became a weapon. She reeks. I'm done. The words weren't shouted. They didn't need to be. The client's mutter, spoken just loud enough for the others to hear, landed like a slap. He didn't even look back as he shoved the curtain aside and left, the door swinging behind him with a thud. She stood there, frozen. The scent he recoiled from wasn't new. It clung to all of them. Bodies soaked in sweat, old linens, traces of the men who came before. She had wiped down between visits, done what she could. A sleeve, a scrap of cloth, even a quick rinse with stale water from a cracked bowl. But it hadn't been enough. The moment the door closed, panic bubbled up in her chest. She dropped to her knees, grabbed a rag, and began scrubbing at her arms and thighs with furious raw strokes. The fabric scratched her already tender skin, but she didn't stop. She couldn't afford to. A complaint like that could mean fewer clients. Fewer clients meant fewer coins. No food, no favor. And worse, being labeled difficult, or lazy, or unclean. Labels like that stuck longer than any scent. The others kept their distance, not from cruelty, but from experience. They'd all been there. There were no answers, no clean water, no soap, no privacy, just blame and the constant burden of fixing what they had no tools to mend. She glanced toward the curtain, heart thudding. Would he tell the madam? Would she lose her corner? Her stale bread? She dug in a pouch and pulled out the only thing she had, cheap wine left over from a drunk client. She poured a little into her palm and splashed it under her arms between her legs. It stung, but it masked something. For now, there were no instructions, no routine, just the whispering fear of rejection. She didn't want to be sent to the lower rooms, or worse, the alley stalls, where the cold bit harder and the men paid less and pushed more. So she worked silently, scrubbed in circles, fanned her body with her hands, checked her breath with her palm. She rubbed mint into her wrists, just a shred left from last week, and dabbed it behind her ears. Then she sat, on the edge of the soiled bedding, and waited for the next client, waited to see if he flinched, waited for the subtle signs, nostrils tightening, eyes narrowing, a hand reaching for a scarf. Any of it could mean rejection. And if he left too? She closed her eyes. There was no winning this, only surviving. One man at a time, one breath at a time. She inhaled through her mouth, slow and quiet, and folded her hands in her lap. Her skin was raw. Her eyes stung, but her face was blank. It had to be. Some whispered of a bathhouse, a place to scrub away the filth and shame, a place where skin might feel like skin again. But like everything else here, that promise came at a price. For a moment, it felt like hope. The door to the bathhouse creaked open, releasing a puff of steam and the thick, heady scent of damp wood and bodies. Inside, the tub stood in the center, a massive basin carved from old timber, blackened and cracked with age. The water shimmered in the dim light, but not with cleanliness. It was cloudy, tinged with a dull brown hue, like steeped tea left too long in the pot. Still, it was something. She stepped in, carefully, toes curling on the slick planks beneath the water's surface. It was warm, warmer than anything else in the brothel. And for one brief breath, her body relaxed. Muscles loosened, eyes closed. Then reality returned. The warmth was not hers alone. The water clung to her skin thickly, carrying the stories of the women who had come before. Oil from rubbed backs, flakes of skin, strands of dark and light hair drifting near the surface like ghosts. She moved deeper, crouching just enough to dip a cloth into the water and scrub at her arms. A blot of something, mud or worse, floated by. She tried to ignore it, tried to believe this was cleansing. It wasn't. There was no soap, no scrubbing brush, no clean cloth, just the illusion of a bath. A ritual repeated because someone said it mattered, though everyone knew it didn't. Her fingers brushed a scab on her thigh, still red, still open. The water would only infect it further. But what choice was there? Move, it's my turn. A sharp voice broke the brief stillness. Another girl stood at the edge, arms crossed, steam curling around her bare shoulders. Behind her, two more waited, impatient. No time to soak, no time to scrub. She nodded once and stood. The water slid down her body in sluggish streams, leaving behind the same grime it had lifted. Her feet touched the floor with a soft squelch. Her skin itched, but she didn't scratch. Not here. She grabbed a rough towel, stiff from previous use, and ran it quickly over herself, trying not to think of whose hands had last held it. Nothing felt different. She still smelled faintly of wine and sweat. Her skin still bore marks from hands and mouths. Her hair, barely rinsed, hung heavy and unwashed down her back. She caught her reflection in a cracked piece of metal nailed to the wall. The face staring back was no cleaner than before, just wetter, Behind her, water splashed as the next girl climbed in. Another cycle. Another false promise. She wrapped the towel around her and stepped toward the small, changing space where damp garments clung to hooks already stained with use. Soon she would return to work. The illusion of cleanliness would fade under touch and breath. But for now, she could pretend. And so she turned toward the pile of garments, each one holding its own history. Stains that didn't come out, tears that told stories no one dared repeat. She shook the dress, but the smell stayed. It clung like breath on a cold morning, sour, stale, and unmistakably human. The fabric, once soft, was now stiff at the seams, crusted with things she didn't name anymore. Sweat from long nights, fluids, hers and theirs, smudges from dirty hands. It had stopped being a garment long ago. Now, it was something else. A shell, a skin. She held it at arm's length, trying not to wrinkle her nose. But it didn't matter. They all wore the same, some with more holes, some with darker stains, but none clean, none truly theirs. There was a trick to wearing it. You shook it out gently, careful not to send flecks of old filth flying. You pinched the sleeves so the cloth didn't touch your face. You stepped into it quickly, before the cold and damp sank into your skin. And when you tied the belt, rough rope, frayed and stained like everything else, you pulled it tight enough to keep the hem from dragging through the slop on the floor. They told stories, those dresses. She could trace her own history along the fraying neckline, where the thread was starting to give. She knew which stains came from her and which didn't. There was a superstition among some of the older girls that keeping a familiar scent on your dress meant clients would return, drawn back like animals following a trail. Washing it too well was risky. Changing it entirely was worse. Too clean, one had once said, her voice low, makes them think you've got something to hide. So most didn't bother. Washing meant fetching water, scrubbing with bare hands, and then waiting days for the fabric to dry in a place where nothing ever dried fully. And if a girl dared to clean too often, she'd be accused of wasting time, or worse, wasting money. A dress washed too frequently wore out faster, and there were no replacements. There were punishments for waste. Once a girl had tried to mend hers, sewing fresh cloth into the underarms to stop the chafing. The madam had torn it out with a knife, muttering about vanity and disobedience. The girl didn't try again. Now as she slid the dress over her skin, she barely flinched at the cold. It stuck in places, damp from the last time she wore it, never fully dry. But it was familiar. It didn't ask questions. It fit like it always did. She tightened the belt, twisting it twice to hold the weight up. She didn't want the edge brushing the floor again, not after what she'd stepped in last night. In the mirror shard, she looked the same as yesterday. And the day before. A silhouette in a stained dress, blending into the rest. No one noticed the differences anymore. The dress was part of her now. Not clothing. Not protection. Just proof that she was still here. Still working. Still worn. And beneath that worn cloth, something else pulsed monthly, unwelcome and unmanaged. The rags awaited. "Fix it quick, he's coming." The whisper came sharp, slicing through the haze of pain that clouded her every movement. She ducked behind the curtain, fingers already fumbling at the rope around her waist. The rag had slipped again. It always did, no matter how tightly she tied it. The cloth, torn from an old underskirt, was too thin, too damp, too used. It squelched against her thigh, already soaked through. She peeled it away carefully, afraid to look, afraid not to. The blood had darkened to brown, and the smell curled her nose. She rinsed it in the bucket nearby, cloudy, cold, reused water, and wrung it out with practiced hands. There were no new rags, just this one and maybe another tucked under her cot, both fraying at the edges, both reeking faintly of mold. They never dried fully in the damp air. She'd tried once to hang them near the fire, but the madam had yelled, too close to where the client sat, too unseemly, too honest. So she rinsed them in silence. She folded them with shaking hands. She slid them back into place and wiped her legs with her palm, then the palm on her dress. The pain twisted low in her belly, sharp, mean, and pulsing. Her thighs were sore from clenching. Her back ached, and still, the footsteps came. There was no pause for blood. The men didn't ask, or if they noticed, they didn't care. Some liked it, some pretended not to see, and if she refused, she wouldn't eat, wouldn't sleep indoors, would lose her spot to another girl who bled and stayed silent. She had learned to keep her voice low and her hips still. The sores came after the third day, raw places where the cloth rubbed too much, itchy spots that wept yellow if she scratched. No one tended them. No one offered clean linen or salve, just the occasional warning, "Don't get sick, sick girls get sent out." She learned to fold the rag just right, placing the softer edge where it hurt most. She learned how to shift her weight so the cloth stayed still when the man was on top of her. She learned how to sit so the blood wouldn't show through the back of her dress, and when it did, she would crouch by the hearth until the shadow dried, then kneel on it to hide the mark. It wasn't shame anymore. Not really. Shame was a luxury she couldn't afford. This was routine now, like dressing, like breathing, like praying for clients who didn't smell too bad and didn't last too long. She stood, fingers already red again. The curtain parted just enough to show a face, a man she didn't know, wouldn't remember. She stepped forward. Pain dulled, the bleeding would stop, but before that, another duty, shaving herself raw to keep the illusion clean. "Don't press so hard it'll scar." The girl beside her whispered the warning without looking, her own eyes focused on the blood pooling just above her knee. She dabbed at it with a strip of linen already soaked with old stains. Beside her, the younger one gritted her teeth and kept going. There was no mirror, no soap, just a scrap of broken metal, a bent piece of tin from an old lid, sharpened on stone, rust flaking near the edge. The girl dipped it in cold water, barely rinsing away the last girl's skin. She ran it across her thigh again, this time slower, but not gentler. The blade caught. She hissed. Blood welled up from the nick just beside the bone, thin and fast. Another scar, maybe. She pressed her palm to it, felt the sting grow sharp beneath the pressure, but she didn't stop. Smooth skin was demanded. Even a hint of stubble meant complaints. Clients would grumble, wrinkle their noses, sometimes leave. The madam didn't care how it was done, only that it was, and no excuses, not for blood, not for pain, not for skin left raw and burning. Once, she'd tried not shaving. She had been too sore, the old wounds still tender. The next man yanked her by the thigh and shouted in the hallway. She didn't get supper that night, didn't get her share of the stale bread the next morning. So now she shaved. Every other night, sometimes more. Even when the cuts were still healing. Even when the pus hadn't stopped leaking. There were no proper blades here. No oil or cream. Just cold water and a cloth to mop up the mess. Sometimes, if a girl liked you, she'd guide your hand. Show you the direction to pull so the blade didn't bite too deep. Whisper a tip. Use ash first. It dulls the sting. But even then, it wasn't enough. The infections crept in fast. First redness, then swelling, then heat beneath the skin that made walking feel like knives. Some girls limped for days, hiding the worst of it. Others tied strips of linen around their thighs, pretending it was for modesty. No one dared ask for help. No one listened if they did. She finished the last swipe, her breath sharp through her nose. Blood trickled again, this time near her hip. She wiped it clean, then tore a piece from her already fraying shift and tied it tight. The bandage wouldn't hold. It never did. But it might keep the wound from soaking her dress. For now. She stood unsteady for a moment. A dull throb pulsed from between her legs. She adjusted her hem, smoothed her hair with one shaky hand, and limped toward the curtain. Another man waited, another hour pretending the pain was pleasure. She would clean herself after, as always. But tonight the sting would come not from the wound, but from the vinegar rinse. She clenched her teeth through the sting. The burn came fast, sharp as a blade, hot as fire. She didn't cry out, didn't flinch, just poured the alcohol down her inner thigh and held her breath as it licked through broken skin and fresh cuts like a curse. It was a ritual now, a cruel routine. After each man left, she ducked behind the curtain, knelt on the stained floorboards, and reached for the jar. The liquid inside was half alcohol, half something else, cheap and sharp, and probably stolen from a backroom shelf. No one asked, no one knew. She soaked the same rag every time, its edges crusted with old blood and unraveling threads. It had once been white, maybe. Now it was the color of old bruises. She pressed it between her legs, fast and hard, ignoring the fresh scream beneath her skin. The others watched sometimes, not out of cruelty, just habit. Girls waiting their turn, eyes glazed, arms wrapped around themselves like armor. They all knew the sound of skin sizzling beneath liquor. They all had their own burns. It wasn't about cleanliness. Everyone knew that. No amount of stinging alcohol could erase the filth, not really. The madam said it freshened the scent. Clients believed it meant effort. But the truth lived in the raw flesh, in the sores that never healed, in the dull ache that followed her into sleep. Some girls used salt, rubbed it in with water and a whisper. Others used vinegar, more affordable, more brutal. She'd tried that once, just once. The pain had stolen her breath and her voice. She had crawled into the corner afterward and pressed her forehead to the wall until the world returned. Now it was alcohol, always the same burn, always the same result. She moved quickly. There was never time. Another man waited, another set of hands, another demand. Her thighs trembled as she wiped again and again, the cloth too soaked to help, just smearing paint around now. But she couldn't stop. She had to be ready. She wrung the rag out in a corner bucket, the water inside dark and sour. No one emptied it. No one replaced it. They all just dipped and wiped and prayed it would be enough. It never was. She folded the rag carefully, tucked it into the wall's crack where the wood peeled just enough to hide things. It was hers. Personal. Even filth became precious when it was all you had. She straightened her dress, smoothed the front, and checked her reflection in a cracked mirror hanging near the door. Only her mouth looked real. The rest, a mask of exhaustion and bruised skin, blurred into the grime. Another curtain moved. A voice called. She walked toward it, every step reminding her of the burn still echoing inside her. And as she moved, her tangled hair fell over her shoulder, forgotten, heavy and uncombed, a silent testament to all she had no time left to care for. It used to shine, once, before the stink, before the nights blurred into one another, before she forgot the last time fingers touched it with care. Now it hung in ropes, greasy, tangled, a nest of filth knotted tight against her scalp. Lice lived in it. She could feel them, crawling, breeding, leaving their tiny eggs near the roots like pearls of shame. Sometimes at night, she'd claw at her scalp until her nails came back red. A girl had once tried to help, sat behind her and combed through the strands with a carved wooden fork. She'd lasted 10 minutes before swearing and tossing the fork aside, the teeth bent and slick with oil and scabs. So she tried her own methods, rubbing ash through it, hoping the grit would suffocate the bugs. Didn't work. She'd even tried wine once, poured it straight through, hoping it would do something, anything, but all it did was sting the open cuts and make her smell like last night's regret. When the clumps grew too tight, she'd cut them out with whatever blade she could steal, rusty scissors, a cracked shard of mirror, even a broken spoon edge once. The sound of it, hair tearing like fabric, had made her wince more than any slap. Some gave up altogether, took a blade and shaved it off. One girl did it while laughing, the sound too loud, too wild. Freedom, she'd called it. But the madam slapped her hard for it, said clients didn't want boys. Still, many did it anyway. Bald was better than lice. Bald didn't itch. Bald didn't make you cry in your sleep when something bit the back of your neck. She hadn't shaved hers. Not yet. She kept it tied back, yanked so tight her scalp pulsed beneath the skin. Every morning she scraped it into a knot, hiding the worst of it. But it wasn't hair anymore. It was a burden, a weight, a reminder. There had been a time when it mattered, when she'd cared what it looked like, how it fell, how it framed her face, when she thought beauty might protect her, might be armor. Now it was just another thing she'd lost, another piece of herself too tired to mourn. "It's easier this way," she muttered once, slicing off a thick strand that clung to her neck like sweat. No one replied. No one needed to. They all understood. Some girls tried scarves, tied around their scalps like bandages. Others wore caps, stolen from men or stitched from torn sleeves. Anything to hide it, anything to stop the whispers of lice. She pressed a stained cloth over her head and tied it at the nape of her neck. It smelled faintly of salt and mold, but it was hers. The lice couldn't be seen now. The shame was hidden. That was all that mattered. Her lips cracked as she smiled at nothing, dry, aching, and already rotting from within. She tried, every morning. She really did. A twig from the courtyard tree, split at the tip with her fingernail and rubbed against her teeth until her gums wept. The bark was bitter, splintery, sometimes moldy, but it was all they had. If she was lucky, one of the older girls passed down a stub of clove or a flake of dried mint. Even a smudge of charcoal from the hearth felt like treasure, but it didn't help. Not really. She bent over the cracked basin, spat thick red streaks into cloudy water, and gagged at the metallic taste in her throat. Her gums pulsed, swollen and dark, teeth shifting in their sockets. One had already fallen out, a molar, left behind in a mouthful of bread. She hadn't even felt it go. The others didn't speak of it, but they all carried the same shame. Cracked lips that bled when they smiled. Breath that curled like rot, even after chewing herbs. She'd heard whispers once, of girls who soaked their mouths in vinegar or scraped their tongues raw with bone fragments. A desperate fight against the slow rot chewing through them from within. The men, of course, noticed. "You're sour today," one had sneered once, pushing her away with a grimace. Another had laughed, plugging his nose like a child. The madam warned her after that. "Mask it, fix it. Clients don't pay for corpses." But how? No money for real salves, no dentist, no medicine, just cracked twigs and hope. So she learned to hide it. She tightened her mouth when she spoke, words slipping through clenched teeth, laughed low and short, turned her face slightly when leaning close, smiled with lips closed. Always, always. The others did the same. Conversations in half whispers, careful not to show what was missing. At night, she lay on her cot with her hand over her mouth, feeling the throb beneath her tongue. She'd dream of her teeth falling like grains of rice onto the floor, woke with a jolt and tasted copper. She hid her smile, ashamed of the gaps. And still, each morning, she chewed a leaf of parsley or a wilted stem of mint, praying it would last long enough to get through the night. It never did. The bitterness in her breath was stronger than any herb, deeper than any prayer. Still, she tucked another leaf between cheek and gum, ignoring the sting. It was a ritual now, more habit than hope. Then she rubbed her fingers together, grimacing at the raw skin on her palms. The next battle waited there, in hands that told their own story. She flexed her fingers, already sore, and turned toward the basin again. The rot would not stop, but neither would she. Her hands were not soft. They hadn't been for years. Knuckles split open along old scars, stained in the creases with ash and dried blood. Fingernails jagged, some peeled so far down they bled at the beds. The grime never left. Not really. It clung beneath the nails under the skin, in places soap never reached because soap never came. She scrubbed anyway. Every morning, every night. Sometimes with ash, sometimes with leftover salt, sometimes just with water so hot it made her skin bubble. The goal wasn't to be clean, it was to not stink, not offend, not give a client a reason to complain. "This rag stings worse every day," she muttered under her breath, wringing out the coarse cloth. Her fingertips left faint smears of red behind. No one answered. They were all too busy scrubbing their own stories away. Her hands had once been small and pretty. She remembered that vaguely. She used to fold them under her chin and daydream. Now they were swollen and stiff. Some mornings, her fingers didn't uncurl until noon. There were days the tremor started early, nerves shot, wrists aching from scrubbing floors, hauling buckets, gripping iron bedposts. She'd learned to hide the shakes, folding her hands in her lap, pressing them to her sides. A trembling hand was weakness. Men noticed weakness. Her palms bore burn marks from spilled wax, calluses from carrying pots, old rope scars from a punishment she didn't talk about. She rubbed those scars sometimes without thinking, like they were reminders that her hands didn't belong to her anymore. They were tools now, like her mouth, like her body, like the rooms she cleaned. And tools didn't rest. Still, she tried to cope. A smear of pig fat stolen from the kitchen, rubbed in when no one looked. Wrapping her fingers at night with scraps of cloth so they wouldn't crack more while she slept. She even chewed off loose skin with her teeth, because pulling it hurt worse. The other girls never commented. They all had hands like hers. One had fingers so stiff she couldn't close her fist. Another kept her hands under a shawl, ashamed of the dark burn on her palm. They didn't talk about it, but they noticed. When someone bled too much, when someone couldn't grip anymore, there was no replacement. No one came to rescue broken hands, so she gripped the rag tighter, letting it scrape against a scab. Her jaw clenched. Her eyes didn't water. The pain was familiar now, almost comforting in its consistency. Her hands still worked. That was enough. And when it wasn't, she made them work anyway. In the corner, a client waited. She didn't look up yet. She wiped the floor one last time, blood and ash mixing in the fabric, her fingers aching. Then she rose slowly, wiping her hands on her skirt, hiding what they had become. Because what came next required other parts, and they hurt even worse. Her hand hovered over her thigh, just for a second, before moving to untie the belt. Below the waist, another war waited. She walked with short steps, not because she was shy, not because she was graceful, but because every step burned. The skin between her thighs had darkened long ago, rubbed raw by rough cloth and rougher nights. Sores formed in folds no one could see, small at first, then wider, cracked open by sweat, friction, and the weight of bodies that pressed too hard for too long. No one asked if it hurt. They didn't have to. Pain was assumed. She hid the sores, fearing judgment. Once, a girl had complained, limped too noticeably. The madam pulled her skirt up in front of everyone, called her lazy, dirty, worthless. That girl hadn't spoken since. She cleaned the hallways now, and never looked men in the eye. So this one learned silence. She learned how to walk without rubbing the raw parts together, learned to tie cloth tightly between her legs, not to absorb, but to protect. Sometimes she used old rags, sometimes torn pieces of her own slip. She folded them over the worst spots, hoping the makeshift padding would dull the sting. It didn't. The cloth bunched up, shifted, made things worse. Still, it felt like doing something, even if it only gave her 10 minutes of relief. 10 minutes before she had to lie back again and pretend she felt nothing. There were no ointments, no warm baths, no rest days, only salt water, if she was lucky, or spit, or a shared bottle of something clear that smelled like fire and made her flinch. And even then, she had to be quick. She couldn't let anyone see her wince too hard, couldn't let the madam notice her limping, couldn't be seen pressing her thighs together after a client left, like she was holding herself together. Because she was. Her fingers shook as she reached beneath her skirt, pressing the cloth back in place. It was already damp, sticky. She didn't know if it was sweat or something worse. She didn't look. She hid the sores, fearing judgment, the voice in her head whispered, as if narrating her own shame. She thought of other girls, the ones who whispered recipes for healing, boiled leaves, mashed onions, warm urine. Desperate knowledge passed like contraband. No one was sure what worked. All they knew was what didn't. Silence and hoping. Still, she said nothing. She just pressed harder, bracing for the next knock at the door. And it would come. It always came, even when her legs trembled, even when blood crusted between her thighs, even when her voice gave out. The brothel didn't care about pain unless it interfered with profit. And pain that didn't bleed openly? That could be denied, so she denied it too. She stood, smoothed her skirt, ignored the sting. The room smelled of sweat and stale perfume. The next man would want her smiling, would not see the cloth pressed against her inner thigh, would not ask, and she would not tell. Later, when he left, she would rinse with what little she had, leftover wine, toilet water, her own spit, whatever she could find, because cleanliness wasn't comfort. It was survival. "Don't spill it. We need it." The whisper came from behind her, urgent, sharp. A hand hovered over the bowl she held, just in case it tipped. Inside, the liquid shimmered darkly. Bark steeped in boiling water, left to cool just enough before it scalded. A handful of ash had been stirred in, thickening it, making it gritty. Some girls added vinegar when they had it. Others a drop of cheap wine or old perfume, just to mask the stink. No one had soap. Soap was for clean people. She knelt beside the cot, lifting her skirt, one hand shaking slightly as she dipped her fingers in the bowl. The mixture was still warm, too warm, but she couldn't wait. She poured slowly, carefully, between her legs. The burn was immediate. It crept up sharp and prickling, then settled into a deeper throb. Her thighs twitched, muscles tightening against the sting. The raw skin reacted with red welts almost instantly, but she didn't stop. This was part of it now. No one came to the brothel to smell sweat or infection. No one wanted to catch the scent of the last man who'd used her. They wanted something fresh, so she made herself smell like bark, like vinegar, like anything but what she truly was. The others moved around her, quiet, busy, all doing the same. Some sat with their skirts bunched at their waists, gently dabbing themselves with cloths dipped in the same potion. Some cried. Some didn't even flinch anymore. It was the routine. Twice a day, sometimes more, they gathered in corners with their little bowls, watching every drop like gold. No one wasted a thing. The ash was scraped from cooking fires, the bark stolen from behind markets or gardens, the wine begged off drunk clients or scraped from forgotten glasses. They shared it, yes, but with rules. Never too much. Never for free. A girl with a full bowl might be surrounded by quiet faces, eyes lowered, voices soft. "Please. Just a little. I'll clean for you tomorrow." Sometimes a few drops were given, sometimes not. This one shared when she could. But tonight, she had barely enough for herself. She rinsed quickly, then used her fingers to spread the gritty mixture along her thighs and over the worst parts. It burned worse than usual, but maybe that meant it was working. Maybe it meant it was killing something. She didn't believe that. Not really. It wasn't about healing. It never had been. These mixtures didn't clean. They disguised. They stung. They irritated. They gave the illusion of effort, of cleanliness. For the next man, not for her. When she finished, she wiped her fingers on the hem of her skirt. The dampness would cling there. The bark smell would follow her. She picked up the bowl and blew on it gently to cool what was left. Then lifting her chin, she splashed it again quickly. A hiss escaped her lips. She hoped it masked the smell. That's all she could hope for. The next room would be inspected. If she was judged as unclean, it wouldn't be bark she'd feel next. It would be the belt. But that was a pain for tomorrow. "You cost us coin. Fix it." The madam's voice cracked through the narrow hallway like a whip. Girls scattered instinctively, some pretending not to hear, others ducking behind curtains or hurrying to find something to scrub. But she didn't have time to hide. A hand grabbed her arm, nails biting in. The client had complained, said she stank, said he couldn't finish, said she ruined the mood. No questions asked, no chance to explain. She was dragged toward the corner of the room, where a chipped basin stood beside a bucket of water gone gray with use. The other girls looked away. One busied herself with folding rags, another hummed tunelessly, too loud to be real. Everyone knew what was coming. First came the slap. Always. Sharp, fast, meant to humiliate more than hurt. Her cheeks stung and her eyes watered, but she didn't cry. Crying could make it worse. Then came the cold water. The basin was tipped without warning. A shock of icy wetness drenched her dress and underthings. She gasped, knees knocking together. The fabric clung like second skin, heavy and humiliating. "You want to be a pig, you'll be treated like one," the madam spat. But it wasn't over. A smaller pot was fetched, metal scorched black at the bottom. She could already smell the oil. They always kept some nearby, not for cooking, for correction. A girl had once whispered that the oil came from the lamps, thick and dirty. Another said it was poured over old meat to hide the rot. No one knew for sure, but they all knew what it did to skin. The madam didn't pour it directly. That would be too obvious. She dipped a cloth in it first, held it aloft, let it drip. Then she pressed it to the girl's inner thigh. A scream tried to escape, but she bit down, hard. Her teeth ground together as the burn spread like fire under her skin. She could hear the hiss of it searing, could smell herself burnt, bitter. It wasn't about teaching, it was about marking. Shame branded into flesh. "You come back out when you smell like something a man would pay for," the madam said, tossing the cloth into the basin. And then she was alone. The room smelled of oil and mold. Her body trembled. She crouched beside the basin, scrubbing her skin with the edge of her sleeve, knowing it would do nothing. There was no standard, no checklist. Just the whim of the man who entered, and the mood of the woman who ran the house. One could say she was fine. Another could punish her for the same. It was never about being clean. It was about being blameless, profitable, pleasing. The other girls moved silently past the curtain, eyes down. No one spoke. No one asked if she was all right. They couldn't afford to. Later, when her thigh still throbbed, and the cloth she used to dry herself clung to open skin, she caught the madam's glare again from across the room. She flinched, then began to scrub, harder than before. The word unclean followed her like a shadow. But outside the brothel, it meant something more, a label she could never escape. She washed, but the label stayed. It didn't matter how many times she scrubbed her skin raw, how many herbs she boiled, how many bitter leaves she chewed for breath. Her skin could be glowing, her scent masked in mint and crushed petals. But to the world, she was still filthy, not unwashed. Filthy. The difference was sharp, and it cut deeper than any slap. Dirt could be removed. Filth was who you were. She remembered crouching by the wash basin before dawn, when the others still slept. She had scavenged fennel stalks and sage leaves from behind the market stalls, half rotten and stepped on, but still scented. She ground them into a paste, mixing with a few drops of wine a man had left behind. She rubbed it over her arms, her chest, even under her fingernails, scrubbing until her skin tingled. Maybe today, she had thought. Maybe if she looked clean, smelled clean, stood straighter, they might treat her like someone real. But the first woman she passed in the alley stepped aside with narrowed eyes. And at the well, a boy yanked his little sister behind him when she stepped forward with her water jug. "Don't touch her," he hissed. "She's one of them." She stood still as they walked away, heat rising in her cheeks, her hands dripping with the water she'd just drawn. She didn't say a word. She didn't fight. What would be the point? The label had been nailed to her skin from the moment she'd entered the house, not by the madams or even the clients, but by the city itself, the wives with their baskets, the priests with their incantations, the merchants who sold her things with a smirk. The label followed her everywhere: unclean, cursed, used. Even when her body no longer bled, even when she kept every rag spotless, even when she ate little to keep her breath sweet, they called her filthy. And worse, some of the girls began to believe it. "I must be," one had whispered in the dark. "Why else would they all see it?" And she had no answer. There were no books to open, no elder to explain that dirt clings to hands, not souls. Only silence, and the faint smell of vinegar water, and the creak of boards beneath restless feet. She still tried. Habit, more than hope. A ritual, maybe. A last, small defiance. Each morning she rinsed her face. Cold water, fingers moving gently over the bruises time hadn't erased. She looked into the warped metal of the basin like it might show her someone different. But the face that looked back was always hers, clean and still condemned. She stood and wiped her hands on her dress, breath steadying. The day would come like all the others, thick with stares and side glances, and men who grunted without looking at her eyes. Nothing would change. Not today. But still, she washed. Some still believed that if they could just cleanse themselves deep enough, they might become someone else. And for many, that dream of escape was tied to the idea of becoming truly clean. "They say she left with the Lord," someone whispered once, low enough for only a few to hear. The story spread like smoke. A girl from another quarter, pale-skinned, soft-voiced, who had caught the eye of a wealthy merchant. He returned for her, they said, dressed in silk and riding a horse with silver tack. He lifted her from the doorway and took her away, to a villa, to another country, to anything but this. No one had seen her since. No one ever did. But that story stuck. It glimmered in the back of the mind like a coin dropped in a well, unreachable, but still shining. And for a while she clung to it. She stole slivers of soap when no one was looking, pressed lemon rinds against her wrists, learned to sit with her knees together, to lower her eyes just so, to speak softly. She mimicked the wives she glimpsed in the market, the tilt of their heads, the calm certainty in their steps. She bathed before clients, not because she had to, but because maybe, just maybe, one would notice. Maybe one wouldn't want to leave her behind. Maybe if she could make herself clean enough, calm enough, gentle enough, she might be chosen. Lifted out. Loved. But reality gnawed the dream to pieces. The men who paused, who lingered, who offered extra coin for a night, they didn't come back for forever. They came back for discounts. And the ones who did rescue girls took them not to villas, but to back rooms where they scrubbed floors instead of backs, where their worth was measured in silence and obedience. Servants, not wives. Pretty property, nothing more. She watched hope drain from the older girls' eyes first. They stopped fixing their hair, stopped trimming their nails. They cleaned because they had to, not because it would save them. Still, she tried a little longer. It wasn't belief. Not anymore. It was habit. A small act of rebellion, maybe. If the world would not give her beauty or love or respect, she would still smell of lavender. That morning, she tucked a sprig into the hem of her dress, right near the breastbone. It would wither by evening, crushed and faded by sweat and use. But for a moment it made her feel like something more. Not a commodity, not filth, just a girl, pretending. Her hands rested briefly over the place where the lavender lay. The others bustled around her, laughing too loud, arguing over clients, soaking rags in sour water. But she stayed still, lips pressed shut, eyes fixed on the beam of light crawling across the floor. There would be no rescue. She knew that now, but there was still the scent of something sweet beneath her dress. Just for her. Some women scrubbed until their skin cracked, not to escape, but to remember that they were still alive. Yet even the body began to give way, starting with the rhythms that once marked their womanhood. She noticed but said nothing. It had been 3 months since her last bleeding. She counted in shadows and bruises, in the number of times she'd washed rags that were not her own. At first it had been a quiet relief. No more cramping, No more rushing to find clean cloths in the dark. No more ruined sheets and whispered scolding. But soon, the silence of her own body began to echo. There was no name for it among the girls, but they all knew. Some stopped bleeding after a few months. Others held on for a year, maybe more. Then one by one their bodies went quiet. They didn't talk about it. To speak it aloud would be to acknowledge something they couldn't fix, that their bodies were breaking down from the inside out. She watched others fold their rags out of habit, then put them away untouched. She did the same, always acting as if next week, or the one after, the blood would return, pretending that nothing had changed, that they were still whole, still useful, still women, because in this place, no blood could mean no value. There was a girl once, Lena, who had stopped cycling early. The madam had whispered about it to a man, thinking she wouldn't hear. She's dried up, wears out fast, that kind. Lena had been sent to the back rooms 2 weeks later, so now she faked it. When the others groaned with real pain, she held her belly too. Walked with slower steps, pressed a warm stone to her stomach at night, changed a clean rag just often enough to keep up the illusion. Sometimes she felt the ghost of cramps, or maybe just imagined them. It didn't matter. What mattered was keeping up the act. But every time she folded an unused cloth, a hollow grew deeper inside her. What else would her body forget to do? The bleeding had been a rhythm, an anchor, a painful reminder of life, but life nonetheless. Now it was just one more thing taken by the trade, the long nights, the stink of oil, the bruises on her inner thighs, the screams swallowed into a pillow. One more thing silenced. She touched her lower belly one evening, fingers drifting lightly, feeling nothing, no swell, no pain, just absence. She thought of how her mother once called it the red moon, a sacred thing, how her aunt had held her the first time it happened, whispering, "Now you are a woman." She had become a woman, and now she was something else, not younger, not older, just emptied. That night, she folded a soft linen rag, clean and white, and placed it back in the wooden box. Not needed, not tonight, not anymore. The room was quiet except for the creak of beds and muffled voices. She lay down on her side, knees drawn to her chest, one hand still resting on her belly as if to ask it, "Where did you go?" The beds held their own stories, soiled cloth, faded stains, the weight of bodies and secrets. They bore witness to what no one would say aloud. "Turn it over. It's cleaner underneath," someone whispered. She didn't look to see who. They all said it at some point. Every girl who'd found a moment of mercy on a mattress less wet, less crawling. The beds weren't really beds, just low wooden frames if they had any at all, with sagging bundles of straw wrapped in patched fabric. Some still held their shape. Others sank under the weight of too many nights, too many bodies. Her own bed stank of old sweat and mold. The cloth cover, once white or maybe blue, was stained every shade of brown and red and yellow. It reeked of unwashed skin, cheap wine, and the slow rot of trapped damp. She flipped the top sheet, more instinct than hope, and shook it gently. Dust and a few fleas scattered. Beneath, the straw had gone soft with moisture in places, hard as sticks in others. A crusted bloodstain shaped like a palm sprawled across the center. She laid a thin shawl over the worst of it. Some girls tore old dresses into rags to cover the straw. Some didn't bother. "It's just more laundry," one muttered. "More proof. Proof of what had happened. Proof of what always would." Every bed held stories. This one had once belonged to a girl who hummed lullabies in the dark, gone now. That one had been Lena's. Her scent still clung to the edge of the frame, a mix of dried lavender and something metallic. Others were passed down without ceremony. When a girl vanished, her bed was stripped or not, and filled again. She lay on her side, avoiding the sunken middle. The straw scratched through the cloth, poking at the backs of her thighs. Something tiny skittered across her leg. She didn't flinch. Sleep didn't come easily here. They slept lightly, ears trained for creaking doors, heavy footsteps, or the drunken breath of someone stumbling into the wrong corner. Some kept their shoes on. Some tied their skirts around their legs so nothing could be pulled aside easily. She used to sleep like a child, arms flung wide, dreams full of open air. Now she curled in tight, knees to chest, fingers gripping the edge of her shawl. She could still hear the girl across the room crying softly into the mattress. She always cried, not loudly, just enough to fill the space between breaths. They didn't speak of what stained the sheets, not directly. But everyone knew. Blood from forced nights, oil from punishment, the faint imprint of a hand pressed hard into skin. Some marks came clean. Most didn't. She shifted, trying to find a cool patch. There wasn't one. The air hung thick. The smell of old sorrow and sweat clung to her nostrils. She pressed her face into the crook of her arm, away from the scent of the straw, and let her body go heavy. There was no comfort in these beds. Only pause. Only waiting. And sometimes in the darkest corners, they woke to silence. Not sleep, not peace, but the stillness of one girl who would not rise again. She didn't scream when she fell. There was no gasp, no wail, no spectacle. Just the soft sound of knees hitting the floor, like cloth dropping from a hook. A fever had taken her days before. The slow kind, creeping behind the eyes, drying the lips, dimming the breath. No one moved right away. They all saw, all knew. But they had learned. Rush to help, and you might be blamed for the body. So they kept scrubbing, stitching, folding sheets that would never be clean. Later, when the madam came, 2 girls were ordered to carry her. No stretcher. Just a stained sheet wrapped around her limbs, still warm. They dragged her through the back passage, over cobbles slick with rain and old waste, to a patch of land no wider than a cart. No priest, no coin for incense, no whisper of her name. The grave was shallow, dug days ago for whoever fell first. Another would follow soon. They always did. One girl whispered a line from a prayer she half remembered. May she find water that is clean. But her voice trembled, and she didn't finish. They covered her in dirt with their hands. The sheet bulged strangely at the knees. One foot, bare and smudged with soot, stuck out. They didn't fix it. She had smelled like clients even in death. Old oil, sweat, something musky and bitter. Death hadn't scrubbed it away. By nightfall, her bed was taken. The straw flipped, the sheet replaced with one slightly less soaked. Another girl curled into the space she left behind. No one cried. Not out loud. But glances lingered longer than usual. A hand clutched a charm tighter. A girl washed her armpits twice, though her shift was already soaked. Some remembered her name, others didn't. She used to hum, one said. She stole lavender from the market, said another. No, that was Mina. Was it? No one was sure. What remained wasn't her name or her voice, not the sound of her laughter or the color of her eyes. What remained was the scent. Faint, sour, clinging to the edges of her blanket. The smell of survival, of use, of being used. Even the flies remembered. And still, the house pulsed on. New clients arrived. Beds creaked. Sheets were turned, scrubbed, wrung. Water boiled. Blood dried. Another girl winced as oil touched skin. The world forgot her the moment she stopped breathing. But I won't. Let this be your prayer if no one else will say one. She was here. She lived in noise and silence. She laughed once. She bled. She swallowed her screams. She buried her own shame so she could keep breathing. And now, she doesn't have to. Her name faded, but the smell remained. So tonight, in your softness, in your warmth, in your clean sheets and safe rooms, remember her. Not as a lesson, not as a warning, but as someone who mattered. Rest tonight and remember those who couldn't. Good night.